The Goody Two-Shoes had their fun, because right now it's bad boy season. The heroes get all of the glory, but we know it's the baddies that do all the heavy lifting. And after all of their hard work of robbing banks, kidnapping girlfriends, and world domination plots, are providing a vital service. I mean, Batman's back isn't gonna break itself. Superhero stories wouldn't be a tenth as interesting if there weren't any large threats to challenge them. They say a good villain doesn't just challenge the heroes physically, but morally as well. But what makes a great villain? What cements a villain into history? That's what we're here to find out. The rules of this video are the same as the last one, but for those of you who haven't seen the last video, you should by the way, only Marvel and DC villains will be considered. Characters will be judged based on how popular they were in their era, and throughout time. For example, the Joker will be judged in the Golden Age Rushmore, and eventually in the All-Time Rushmore, but will be excluded from the Silver Age or Bronze Age discussions. Characters will be judged on their cultural impact, relevance, quality of appearances, and the only criteria that really matters... It's my opinion! Oh yeah, and if I don't mention your favorite villain, doesn't mean I hate them or anything. The Hero Rushmore had a lot of competition, and for every hero, there are a dozen or so villains. So if I leave anybody out, let me know. So with all of that out of the way, let's kick off the Supervillain Mount Rushmore. The Golden Age of comics, being the infancy of superhero media, takes a very different approach to its villains compared to the modern day. Either being overt World War II propaganda, or a villain of the week that was never actually intended to return after their first appearance. So the fact that some of the most iconic supervillains ever came from this era is kind of a miracle. Characters like Joker, Lex Luthor, the Penguin, Catwoman, Clayface, Two-Face, the Riddler, the Scarecrow, Cheetah, Black Adam, and the Red Skull. Oh wow, most of those were Batman villains, huh? Dude really does have the best rogues gallery. And only one timely comics villain in contention? I guess Evil Knight, Grano, Bamboo Knife Butcher, and Hair Swastika didn't do enough to make the cut. But speaking of characters that do make the cut, I'm not gonna waste anybody's time here. The Joker obviously makes the Rushmore. The Joker is not just the most well-known DC villain, he's one of the most well-known characters, period. It's not hard to see why. He has a striking and instantly recognizable design, he bounces off the Dark Knight expertly. The writers knew they hit the jackpot pretty quickly after introducing him. I mean, not instantly, because the original plan was to kill him off after his introduction, but DC is sure glad that they didn't. Just look at how many appearances he has in the Golden Age alone. I think what works best about the Joker is twofold. The first, his relationship with the Dark Knight being his exact opposite and testing the limits of Batman's morality. But the second, and in my opinion more underappreciated aspect, is his versatility. He works as a ruthless gangster, a silly, harmless prankster, and as a demented psychopath hell-bent on carnage. He's a blank canvas, and I mean that in the best way possible. Another character that easily makes the Rushmore is Lex Luthor. How do you challenge the Man of Steel, a god amongst men, who can do whatever bullshit the writers think up? You give him a force he can't just punch his way out of. Lex Luthor, the symbol of corporate and political corruption, the criminal mastermind that takes the American way that Superman represents and showcases to the audience the American reality. Lex Luthor is Superman's most iconic villain for a reason. With two of the most recognizable villains out of the way, it only makes sense that the most recognizable villain, no hero, no back to villain, now hero again, oh shit, what is he now? Catwoman. The next member of the Rushmore is Catwoman. Yeah, Catwoman's allegiances aren't exactly set in stone, and that's by design. She's a femme fatale that always keeps Batman, and by extension the audience, on their toes. And she's damn good at it too, because I wasn't even fully sure that she counted as a villain. But ultimately, I decided that since she spends the majority of her time as Batman's foe, she counts as a villain, and makes the Golden Age Rushmore. The final slot in this Rushmore has some pretty strong competition, but after some thought, I decided that the Red Skull was the most deserving of an inclusion. A large part of the Golden Age's image is blatant World War II propaganda. Watching strong American heroes fight for freedom against the evil German forces. And at least one of these characters on the Golden Age Rushmore should reflect that key aspect of comic book history. And I see no better option than the only one who is still relevant today. Now, I love Scarecrow. Honestly, he's one of my favorite villains. The fear toxin is such a cool gimmick. Being forced to literally face your fears is such an interesting scenario for a wide variety of stories. However, he didn't actually even get the toxin until 1967. So due to that, and his general underutilization in the Golden Age, he doesn't make the cut. The same goes for Riddler, Clayface, and Cheetah. Two-Face, Black Adam, and the Penguin are all popular characters, but just didn't quite stack up to the Red Skull. In fact, if I didn't count Catwoman as a villain, one of them would have surely taken her place. Speaking of place, you might want to put me in mind after seeing my selection for the next age. The Comics Code Authority is a self-policing code made to evade government intervention. Due to the numerous regulations imposed, villains' motives and actions morphed from hardened criminals to something Saturday morning cartoon villains would scoff at. And one might think that the regulations would severely and negatively impact the writer's creativity. However, the old motto, limitations breed creativity, was proven correct here, because the Silver Age is easily the most dense era for villains, showcasing many iconic characters like Brainiac, Bizarro, General Zod, Gorilla Grodd, Captain Cold, Starro, Black Manta, Poison Ivy, Sinestro, and Reverse Flash. And that's just DC's villains. Marvel Comics, as we know it, began in this era too, and they quickly established themselves as a threat to DC's market, creating quality characters like Doctor Doom, Loki, Magneto, Galactus, Kingpin, Juggernaut, Kang the Conqueror, Ultron, Mandarin, and the Abomination. Wow, that's a lot of characters, right? Wrong, because I didn't even mention the Spider-Man villains. You know, the only hero with a comparable rogues gallery to Batman, with villains like Electro, Sandman, Kraven the Hunter, the Rhino, Vulture, the Lizard, Doc Ock, Mysterio, and the Green Goblin. I could fill 4 or 5 different Rushmores just with the Silver Age characters alone. So I'm not gonna give any explanation for why every single character didn't make it. If I did, we'd be here all day. But with brevity in mind, let's get an obvious selection out of the way first. Magneto. Magneto is the most tragic villain we've discussed so far. A Holocaust survivor that was granted immense power that could be used to help humanity. However, that humanity denigrates him and others like him as abominations and advocates for his kind to be detained or even killed. On top of that, his best friend, the person he's supposed to trust the most, tells him to work with that humanity and not to scare them. All I'm trying to say is that the Brotherhood did nothing wrong. That it's easy to understand from Magneto's point of view why he'd become a political extremist. On top of his backstory, his fights with the X-Men are layered with tragedy, as it's clear that Magneto and Professor X still care for each other. It's just their ideological differences that have led them to the opposite sides of the battle. So, due to the depth of Magneto's stories, alongside an uncanny design and badass powers, lands him on the Silver Age Rushmore. Another easy inclusion on the Rushmore is the Latvian dictator, Doctor Doom. The arch nemesis of the Fantastic Four strolls right onto the Rushmore with ease. I think the reason Doctor Doom has stuck with readers for so long is his menacing look, his impressive intellect, his mastery of magic and science, and an ego that dwarfs even his own intelligence. And that ego is one of the humanizing elements that cements Doom as a fascinating character. Much like Luthor, his own pride gets in the way of his own success more often than not. Speaking of pride, the next member of the Rushmore has that in spades, the Green Goblin, the most famous foe of the most famous character in all of Marvel. It was inevitable to have a Spider-Man villain in the Silver Age Rushmore, but what sets the Green Gobby apart from the other arachnid antagonists is that Norman is someone from Peter's personal life. He's one of the very few villains that knows Peter's identity, and most importantly, Norman has the same dichotomy in his identity that Peter has. Peter, in his civilian life, was a mild-mannered, nerdy guy, but as Spider-Man, was a wisecracking, confident thorn on the side of common thugs and freak science experiments. Similarly, Norman is a cold, calculating businessman in his civilian life, and a crazed maniac as the Green Goblin. And did I mention he's single, ladies? The final slot in this Rushmore was the hardest to fill in this entire video. There are so many villains that are worthy of the position, but eventually, I narrowed it down to Brainiac, Loki, Doc Ock, the Kingpin, Galactus, Starro, and the Petty Prince, Reverse Flash. Because of the depth of the character pool in this era, there are strong arguments for any of these characters, and there's no way to fill the final slot without angering someone. With all that being said, the fourth member of the Silver Age Supervillain Rushmore is Brainiac. Did you know that the insult Brainiac comes from the character Brainiac? That's right, that 1950s jock that threw your dad into the locker was actually, indirectly, a nerd himself. That'll show him. Brainiac, however, is much more than a few free points on Trivia Night. He's one of Superman's most recognizable villains for a reason. He initially embodied a very simple dynamic: the world's strongest man versus its smartest, but slowly and surely evolved to reflect our fears of our own creations rising up and replacing us, a concept that is more and more relevant as time goes on. Now, for every one of you that's happy to see Brady on the Rushmore, there are about 10 of you with pitchforks outside of my house right now, so I'll explain why some of your favorites didn't make it, in a fruitless effort to keep my skin. Loki and Starro, while important villains with a lot of history, both being the first antagonists of Marvel and DC's most popular hero groups, they just don't quite have the name recognition of the other four. At least not yet. I love the Reverse Flash, and how he represents how your greatest haters were once your most ravenous fans, but he isn't quite on the level of the others, unfortunately. Doc Ock would have made this list if the competition wasn't as ridiculously steep as it is. However, the fact that he plays second fiddle to the Green Goblin significantly hurts his case. Kingpin and Galactus were both pretty hard cuts, both being the figureheads of two giant elements of the Marvel Universe, street-level crime, and the greater cosmic universe. I decided that Brainiac should go over all of them by a hair, and quite honestly, if you think any of them deserve the spot, then go right ahead. I've debated this point in my mind too much. Brain hurty. Moving right along to the all-time list, Doctor Doom and Magneto take Red Skull and Catwoman's place. They didn't necessarily get less popular as time went on, it's just that comparatively they don't quite stack up to some of Marvel's best villains. And while we're on the subject of stacking up, following up on the Silver Age's character pool is definitely a tall order. Does the next era's lineup even stand a chance of stacking up? The Bronze Age is a transitional period of comic book history. A period of writers slowly bending the rules of the Comics Code Authority so much that the code lifted some of its more restrictive policies. This would keep going until 1984, when the code denied Swamp Thing number 29 the seal of approval, and DC said, "Fuck it," and published the book anyway. This would be the beginning of the end of that regulation, and the loosening grip of the CCA was evident in the heroes introduced at the time, but was even more clear by the changes to villains of this era. Old villains, once reduced to comedic pranksters, slowly but surely regained their old menacing motivations and actions. And the new villains introduced were, well, why don't I just show you? Darkseid, the tyrannical ruler of Apocalypse. The Mad Titan Thanos, the big bad inspired by Darkseid. Bullseye, a man that proves the pen could be as mighty as the sword. The head of the League of Assassins, Ra's al Ghul. Deathstroke, the Terminator. The shape-shifting mutant Mystique. Killer Croc. He's a Killer Croc. Taskmaster. Anything you can do, he can do better. Sabretooth, the only character that smells worse than Wolverine. And the big bad behind the Crisis on Infinite Earths event, the Anti-Monitor. Alright, I'm not wasting any time. Darkseid and Thanos both make the Rushmore. They're both big, powerful tyrants of the universe that strike fear into the hearts of their enemies. And the only thing that separates these two men is their motivation. Darkseid seeks the anti-life equation to subjugate all life on the universe, for its own sake, a mustache-twirling villain through and through. Thanos, however, is motivated by his obsession with Lady Death, which is completely understandable. Fumbling a bad bitch changes a man. The next character that makes the Rushmore is Ra's al Ghul. Ra's introduction adds a large amount of lore to the Batman ethos with his League of Assassins. He also has an interesting relationship with the Dark Knight, having some pretty intense ideological differences with the Caped Crusader, but respecting Batman so much, he's offered him to become his successor on numerous occasions. That unique relationship allows Ra's and Batman to have very interesting and engaging conversations and debates. The final slot of the Bronze Age Rushmore belongs to the right-hand woman, and sometimes leader of the Brotherhood, Mystique. Mystique is so ingrained in the X-Men mythos that when I was researching this video, I was genuinely surprised to see Mystique wasn't part of the original Brotherhood. I am fully aware that my generational bias is showing here, because I grew up with the 2000 X-Men movies, so I just assumed Mystique was a founding member. However, I still think my assumption is meaningful, because I can't really imagine the Brotherhood without her. Mystique's powers are a great tool for any writer. Most villains have aggressive abilities that are meant to dominate your foes. Mystique, however, is great at subterfuge and deception, misdirection, gathering information, and a lot more. Any story she's involved in causes the reader to get paranoid. Did Scott just confide in Jean, or did he give Mystique everything she needed? Mystique's storytelling potential and her instantly iconic status places her firmly on the Bronze Age Rushmore. Deathstroke and Sabretooth were pretty hard cuts, but I personally couldn't put them over any of the other characters. All four of them are generally more well-known than them. The same goes for Killer Croc, Bullseye, and Taskmaster to a lesser extent. The Anti-Monitor could have made the Rushmore based off his impact in comics alone. However, he isn't really remembered because of his character, more because of the importance of the Crisis event in DC Comics, and the retcons and continuity tweaks the event caused. Moving right along to the all-time Rushmore, Magneto and Doctor Doom will be replaced by Green Goblin and Darkseid. The reason for Green Goblin making the list now instead of the Silver Age is primarily due to being the catalyst for the death of Gwen Stacy. Neither Doom nor Magneto were a part of a story as iconic as that one in this era. Darkseid makes it because he's Darkseid. However, don't worry too much about Doom and Magneto. They have a strong chance of jumping right back onto the list in our next era. For those of you who haven't watched the last video, I divided the modern age of comics, an age that normally lasts from 1985 to the modern day, into two more digestible sections. The first of which is defined by the growing influence of superhero media outside of the comics, matching the importance and significance of the comics themselves, whether that can be attributed to comics properties being treated seriously enough for more accurate portrayals, or the decline of comic book sales in the 90s. The second section will be defined when we get to it. The modern age either introduced characters into the popular zeitgeist, or solidified them into the minds of the general audience. Just a few examples are the 90s Spider-Man, Batman, and X-Men cartoons. Each of these shows showcased a wide variety of these heroes' respective rogues galleries, both classic and contemporary. These shows were a lot of kids' first introduction to these characters, and their impact is undeniable. I mean, how many millennials' favorite Spider-Man villain is Venom? How many millennials' favorite Joker is Mark Hamill? How many millennials hate Jubilee? The characters of consideration for the modern age are the Ancient Mutant Apocalypse, the monstrous murder of the Man of Steel Doomsday, the man who broke the bat, Bane, the communist cyborg KG Beast, the serial-killing symbiote Carnage, the most aggressively 90s character ever created, Onslaught, the criminal mastermind Hush, the crime boss Black Mask, and last but certainly not least, Harley Quinn, the most impactful original character from Batman the Animated Series. Venom and Deadpool are disqualified from the contention as they appeared in the previous Rushmore, because they spent a lot more of their time as anti-heroes than villains. Now that I explained why Venom and Deadpool aren't going to be on the list, I'm sure I won't get a single comment about how I forgot them. One character I certainly have not forgotten is Venom's sadistic spawn Carnage. Cletus Cassidy makes the Rushmore because Venom isn't eligible. Nah, the actual reason is because of his expansion of the symbiote abilities, his sick design, and his sadistic personality. Eddie is a man that sought out revenge on Spider-Man because he blamed him for his life spiraling out of control. But eventually, Venom and Spider-Man came to an understanding, and Eddie becomes an anti-hero, no longer defined by his relationship with the Wallcrawler. Carnage, however, is only motivated by his own desire to destroy for its own sake. He's like the Joker in that respect, and shows how terrifying the Joker would be if he was given superpowers. Simply put, Carnage is really cool. Speaking of cool, nothing is cooler than giving Batman the biggest ass-kicking he's ever received in your introductory story. Bane is a villain, created with the goal of giving Batman the ultimate challenge. A man that matches Bruce physically and mentally. The man that broke the Bat. Nightfall, the storyline that introduced Bane, has become an instant classic, and Bane became an instant mainstay of Batman's rogues. Bane was also adapted into several forms of Batman media outside of the comics, right out the gate. However, I'm disappointed to say that most downplay Bane's intelligence to some degree, and some turn him into a mindless monster, completely missing the point. However, even if the other interpretations of Bane missed the mark, the fact that they were adapting him so soon after his introduction in the first place is evidence enough of his impact. With all that said and done, Bane easily makes the modern age Rushmore. However, if impact is what we're looking for, then Apocalypse, the first mutant, has that in spades. Following up a villain like Magneto is a tall order, but if anybody could fill it, it's Apocalypse. His intimidating design, his genius-level intellect, and his absolutely busted abilities are just some of the qualities that make him an iconic X-Men foe. It also doesn't hurt that he showed up in the X-Men cartoon and was the main antagonist in the second X-Men Legends game. The final slot of the modern age Rushmore belongs to Harley Quinn. Now, I typically give preferential treatment to characters created in the comics, but the impact of Harley Quinn is undeniable. Doomsday doesn't make the cut because despite his sick powers, intimidating look, and his role on one of the most culturally important Superman books, he fills the anti-Monitor role of being important for the historical context of the comic rather than his actual characterization. Onslaught doesn't make the cut because the modern age is more than just the 90s. And the same applies to KG Beast, except for him it's the 80s. Moving right on to the all-time Rushmore, Magneto easily takes back his spot from Darkseid. Darkseid did receive outside media attention, that's for sure, but it was nothing compared to the cultural juggernaut of the X-Men in the 90s and 2000s. However, Doom fails to steal back his spot from the Green Goblin. Simply put, the Fantastic Four movie sucked, and Sam Raimi's Spider-Man is peak. That's the real tragedy of it all, isn't it? The quality of the books themselves matter less and less over time, as outside media draws in an exponentially larger audience. Gee, I hope there isn't some sort of event that makes that state of affairs even worse. I'm gonna make a safe assumption here and assume that everybody watching this video is at least vaguely aware of what the MCU is, so I'll save the explanation. Instead, I'll explain what the hell the postmodern age is. If the modern age is the influence of outside media becoming just as important as the comics themselves, the postmodern age is the tipping point, where outside media influence is more important than the source material. See the MCU and all the characters that exploded in popularity due to its influence. Or to a significantly lesser extent, the DCEU introducing Steppenwolf to the Uncles of America. However, the books are still relevant, especially in the creating characters department. You see, for how important outside media is in this era, their over-reliance on previously established characters will ensure that the comics will always have their place. And that place is to be a segue for the character introductions. The characters in consideration for the postmodern age are Atrocitus, Dexstar, Larfleeze, Gore the God Butcher, Godspeed, Null, God of Symbiotes, the Court of Owls, the Inheritors, and Perpetua. And right off the bat, Gore the God Butcher makes the Rushmore. He was the antagonist of one of the most critically acclaimed Thor stories, a story so loved that it was adapted into Thor Love and Thunder. You know, the one with the goats and the bad CG. However, despite Thor 4's reception, Gore the God Butcher himself made his mark in the postmodern age. Gore made the list due to his badass design, his tragic backstory, and being the only character in contention to be included in the biggest superhero thing ever. The next character to make the list is Atrocitus. I mean, sure, he first appeared in December 2007, so he doesn't technically make the postmodern age, but it's only a month off, so I hope you can forgive me for fudging the dates here. However, Atrocitus doesn't merely make the list based on technicality. Atrocitus is the creator and leader of the Red Lantern Corps, and the embodiment of rage. And that rage is not unfounded. His entire world and family were slaughtered by manhunters, basically robotic space police. Then, he was crucified by the creators of the manhunters twice, and worst of all, he was forced to watch 2 30-second unskippable ads on YouTube. On top of being featured in some great Green Lantern runs, Atrocitus also makes appearances in Green Lantern the Animated Series, the Green Lantern Emerald Knights, and made the Injustice 2 roster. Because of all of the above reasons, Atrocitus easily makes the postmodern Rushmore. The next character that makes the Rushmore is Godspeed. Godspeed is the newest of many evil speedsters that the Flash family has had to tangle with, and out of all of the Flash villains, he easily has the best name and design. Godspeed is also notable for being in 2 places at once, something Barry has often wished he could do. However, Godspeed is not merely a slick design and power set. He's a man who was gifted incredible powers just like Barry, but unlike Barry, he uses his powers to enact revenge, to become judge, jury, and executioner. Because his brother's killer was let go due to a technicality, and that technicality is coincidentally related to Barry's origin. He is not merely a physical threat to Barry, he's an ideological one. Godspeed also made several appearances on the CW Flash TV show, a show that introduced many casual audience members to the mythos of the Flash, so that also helps Godspeed's case. The final slot of the postmodern Rushmore is kind of a toss-up between the Court of Owls and Null, the God of Symbiotes. You see, I don't normally put entire organizations or teams as entries of the Rushmore. I put Ra's al Ghul on the Bronze Age Rushmore, not the League of Assassins. I mean, there technically is a singular final encounter of the Court of Owls story arc in Lincoln March, but he's not nearly as interesting or memorable as the Court itself. The Court of Owls is a concept that I'm kinda surprised hasn't already been explored in the Batman mythos. A secret society composed of old money elites controlling Gotham from the shadows was a great idea executed very well. Null, the God of Symbiotes, isn't exactly a slouch in the memorability or impact department either. Adding a lot of lore to Venom and the symbiotes as a whole, he's even the creator of the Necro Sword that Gore uses. It ultimately came down to the Court of Owls having more outside media attention, and Null being a singular entity. So I'll leave it up to you on which you believe deserves the spot more. One of my biggest mistakes in the last video, besides completely omitting way too many characters, was that I relied too much on recency bias. I mean, I still believe my final 4 for the superheroes was pretty respectable. But when it's called the all-time Rushmore, my view shouldn't be narrowed down to the last, 15 years. That being said, the all-time Rushmore of supervillainy is the Joker, Lex Luthor, Dr. Doom, and Magneto. These 4 villains are not only the most iconic and impactful villains in comics, they are not merely outside media darlings, making many memorable appearances over the years. These characters have proven to stand the test of time. Villains that were iconic when my father was a kid, they were iconic when I was a kid, and they will be iconic during my kid's childhood. There are many characters that were on the same level as these 4, but there are only 4 slots to fill, and that limitation was a lot harder to parse through this time. I thought the Hero Rushmore was full of cuts, but the Villains Rushmore blows that one out of the water. However, that makes a lot of sense. I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the villains are the heel that the superhero stories stand on. Without them, superhero stories would feel hollow. They are reflections of our worst qualities. They're reminders of our greatest insecurities. And we love them not in spite of those factors, but because of them. Thank you all for watching. I'm the Boomer Zoomer, and I'm zooming!